Over the weekend, there were celebrations in honor of gay pride. The energy was high, especially following the Supreme Court's ruling on Friday to lift the ban on same-sex marriage. But Mississippi, Louisiana, and now Texas are fighting back. The Texas Attorney General said Sunday evening that county clerks do not have to issue marriage licenses to gay couples because of religious beliefs. CBS News Justice reporter Paula Reid joins us now. Paula, how are these three states able to refuse to recognize the ruling? Is this a political move?
This is completely expected. Every case that goes before the Supreme Court is rooted in controversy. It's an unsettled question of considerable significance. And every time there's a high-profile ruling, you see some sort of resistance. But compared to the resistance that we saw against Brown v. Board of Education, Roe v. Wade, Bush v. Gore, Citizens United, this resistance is minimal and it's disjointed. These states are focusing on the states' rights question and also the question of a liberty interest, the constitutional protections. The thing is, those were the very questions before the before the Supreme Court, and they have ruled same-sex marriage is the law of the land. There is no appeal. Now, you may see some movement on whether or not these individual states have to allow an exemption for any employee who has a religious objection to issuing same-sex marriage licenses. There you might see some compromise, some sort of accommodation. But at the end of the day, same-sex marriage is the law of the land. And many of the individuals making these objections, they're politicians. Even the attorneys general who are objecting to this, they know that the Supreme Court is the final word. It's a court of last resort.
And so, Paula, how long are these states going to be able to resist the law of the land?
Well, the decision doesn't actually go into effect for another 3 weeks. So it's very easy to object until the law is actually viable. And then you might see some back and forth in the courts about whether or not those employees who have a religious exemption, whether or not they do need to issue these same-sex marriage licenses. But ultimately, this whole question is going to shift from the issue of same-sex marriage licenses to services that nonprofit organizations or private businesses need to extend to same-sex couples.
So, Paula, you touched on this, but how does this translate then in practical terms to private institutions? What are the expectations there going forward?
Well, this is the question, and Justice Kennedy even touched on this in his opinion. He says that the First Amendment should protect churches and religious organizations from having to perform same-sex marriages. But then there's the question of religiously affiliated organizations, colleges, or nonprofit institutions. Do they need to extend benefits to same-sex couples? And then the really complicated question is for private businesses. Does, for example, a florist need to provide flowers for a same-sex couple's wedding? We saw in Indiana, they tried to pass a law to protect those businesses and their religious rights, and it turned into a political mess. So the issue of same-sex marriages, license need to be issued by the state. That is the final word from the Supreme Court. But now we will see some legal wrangling in the states as to whether or not they will try to pass additional laws to protect religious organizations, religiously affiliated organizations, and private businesses.
And Paula, before we let you go, could we also see a battle going forward with the refinement of this law? In other words, we know that after the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were passed, there was still a lot of work to be done, hence the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, of 1965, the Voting Rights Act. Are there other steps that activists will probably look to take, not through the Supreme Court, but perhaps through some of the local courts?
Sure, I think they'll be looking at all of their options. But ultimately, if you look at public opinion, even if you look at the opposition to this decision, it is much weaker than what we've seen in the past. So I think that they will really focus on where they think they can be successful, and that is in protecting religious organizations and potentially in some states successfully protecting private businesses from extending their services or benefits to same-sex couples.
Paula Reid in Washington. Thank you so much, Paula.
The GOP field has been very vocal about Friday's ruling, and now Ohio Governor and possible 2016 Republican candidate John Kasich says it's time to move on. He spoke with John Dickerson on Face the Nation.
I think there's so many other things now that we have to focus on. It's going to be job growth, defeating poverty, healing the division between races, coming up with an immigration solution that's going to be fair and is going to help people, rebuilding our national defense. That's where the energy ought to be focused on the things that we know are vital to strengthen our country, John. I'm trying to avoid your question, but frankly, my head is now moving in the direction of what we can do to solve problems here together.
You're trying to avoid the question, which sounds like you're already a presidential candidate. When are you going to announce?
Well, first of all, I'm not avoiding it. You know, I do believe in traditional marriage, but the court has ruled, and it's time to move on.